the day my brother signed my name on a legal document and transferred my late mother's house out of my name. I was standing at her graveside in a black coat that still smelled like her perfume. I remember the snow. It was that specific kind of Ontario winter snow that falls sideways and gets into your collar no matter what you do. I remember my heels sinking into the frozen ground. I remember thinking that the worst thing that had ever happened to me was happening right now, right in this moment, and that nothing could possibly make it worse. I was wrong, obviously. But I'm getting ahead of myself. And before I tell you what happened next, and I promise you, what happened next is something my brother did not see coming. I want to ask you something first. Where in the world are you watching this right now? What city? What time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. And honestly, knowing someone out there is listening to this makes it easier to say out loud. My name is Avril. I'm 32 years old. I grew up in a small city about 2 hours east of Toronto, Ontario. And what I'm about to tell you is the truest, most disorienting, and ultimately most clarifying thing I have ever lived through. We were 3 kids in that house. My older brother, my younger sister, and me, the one in the middle. My mother, Diane, raised us mostly on her own after my father left when I was 9. He moved to Alberta for work, and the calls got shorter, and then they stopped. My mother never said anything bitter about him in front of us. Not once. That was the kind of woman she was. The kind who absorbed things quietly and just kept going. She worked as a medical office administrator for 23 years at the same clinic. She drove a used Civic, clipped coupons out of the Sobeys flyer on Thursdays, and paid off her mortgage 3 years early because she was meticulous and determined, and she understood that security didn't come from luck. My brother Elliot was 6 years older than me. Loud in the way that people who've never had to try very hard tend to be loud. He had that effortless confidence that looks like competence from far away. Up close, it was something else. He was always between jobs, always between plans, always between explanations for why the last thing hadn't worked out. My mother bailed him out more times than I could count. Credit card debt when he was 26, first and last on an apartment at 29, a business idea involving food trucks that collapsed so completely. I don't think any of us ever fully understood what happened. My sister's, Bedit, was 4 years younger than me. She lived out in BC now, had since her mid-20s. We talked on the phone maybe once a month. She was warm, and she meant well, but she was also, fundamentally, not present for most of what I'm going to tell you. She didn't know how bad things had gotten because she wasn't here to see it. I was the one who stayed. I want to be clear about that because it matters. I stayed not because I had to, but because I couldn't imagine leaving my mother alone with all of it. I graduated from Queen's University, with a degree in health information management. I got a job at a regional hospital in health records administration, worked my way up to a senior coordinator role, and eventually took a position at a larger hospital network in Ottawa that paid me significantly more, and gave me work I genuinely cared about. I was good at systems. I was good at order. I think I'd spent my whole childhood building that skill out of necessity. When your household is chaos, you learn to impose structure wherever you can. I moved back closer to home 3 years ago, not to Ottawa but to a city 40 minutes from where I grew up, partly because of my mother. She'd been diagnosed with an early stage of COPD. Nothing immediately critical, but a thing that would progress, a thing that needed watching. My brother had made sympathetic noises from his apartment in Mississauga and said he'd be around more. He wasn't around more. I drove to her place every second weekend. I handled her insurance paperwork, her CRA correspondence, her medication refills. When she needed her eavesdrops cleaned last fall, I was the one who got up on the ladder. When her furnace made a sound in February that she described as a grinding but not a bad grinding, I was the one who called the HVAC company and waited for the technician and made sure the carbon monoxide detector was working. My brother called her on her birthday and sometimes at Christmas. About a year before she died, my mother sat me down at her kitchen table. The same table she'd had since we were kids, the one with the burn mark from a casserole dish that she'd always covered with a cloth placemat. She told me she wanted to make sure I was protected. Those were her words. Protected. She had a lawyer, a woman she'd been using for years, and she'd updated her will. The house, which she owned outright, and which had appreciated significantly in a market that had done nothing but appreciate for 2 decades, was to go to me. She explained it simply, and without drama. Elliot had already received money over the years, she said. More than I knew about. She loved him. She would always love him. But she'd done what she could for him, and now she wanted to make sure that I, the one who'd been here, who'd stayed, who'd shown up, had something solid under me. I told her I didn't need it. She said she knew I didn't need it. That was the point. I left that kitchen feeling something I didn't fully have a word for. It wasn't relief exactly. It was more like being seen. Like having someone hand you proof of something you'd believed for a long time but couldn't confirm. I should have kept a copy of that. Well, somewhere on my person at all times. I know that now. My mother passed in late October, a Tuesday, just before 6 in the morning. I was there. I'd been sleeping on the couch in her spare room for the last 3 weeks because things had moved faster than any of us expected. Her lungs, in the end, just gave. She went quietly, which was consistent with who she had been her whole life. I called Elliot from her driveway at 6:15. He said he'd be there as soon as he could. He arrived at 11:40. He hugged me, looked around the house for a few minutes with an expression I couldn't read at the time, and then said he was going to get us food. He came back with Tim Hortons and we sat at the same kitchen table and didn't say very much. The funeral was 4 days later. Bet flew in from Vancouver. We stood in that sideways Ontario snow and I stared at the ground and I told myself that I would get through the paperwork and the logistics and then I would give myself permission to fall apart somewhere private. What I did not know, what I had absolutely no idea about, was that somewhere in the 6 days between my mother's death and the moment I stood at that graveside, my brother had made a phone call. Not to me, not to Bet, to a different lawyer. The story I pieced together later, from documents and from the woman at the law office who was, I think, genuinely mortified by what she'd been part of, was this. Elliot had found a copy of my mother's previous will, not the updated one, a version from 7 years ago, before she'd sat me down at the kitchen table, before she'd made her decision. In that earlier version, the house was split between the 3 of us equally. He brought that document to a small estate law office across town. He told them my mother had died without an updated will on file. He produced the old one. He had a copy of my mother's signature from old documents she'd had at the house. Her handwriting was familiar to him. It wasn't identical. But it was close enough that in the chaos of an estate with no clear executor challenges, no one looked very hard. I didn't find out any of this the day of the funeral. I didn't find out the week after, when I was sitting in my own apartment in a kind of gray fog that I now understand was grief. But at the time just felt like my brain had been filled with wet concrete. I found out 5 weeks later, when I received a letter from a law office I didn't recognize informing me that the property transfer had been completed, and that my mother's house had been registered in 3 names. Mine, Elliot's, and Bettit's, each holding an equal share. I read it 3 times. Then I called the number at the bottom of the page, and a very polite paralegal explained that the estate had been settled, based on the will on file, and that if I had concerns about the document's validity, I would need to speak with a lawyer. I sat on my apartment floor for a long time after I hung up. Here's the thing about me. I work in health information management. I work with records. I understand what documentation is. I understand what it means when something doesn't match, and I am very, very good at finding the thing that doesn't match. It's the skill I built out of necessity, and then turned into a career. My mother had a lawyer. I knew her name. I called her the next morning. What she told me made something go very cold and very quiet in my chest. She had the updated will, signed, witnessed, dated, drawn up 14 months before my mother's death. In it, the house went to me, only me. She had assumed that as the named executor, I would be in touch. She hadn't heard from anyone. She hadn't known there was a competing document until I called her. She said she was so sorry. Her voice was careful and professional, and underneath it I could hear that she was also furious. I want to tell you what happened next, but first I need to tell you what it felt like to stand in my apartment and understand fully what my brother had done. Because it wasn't just the house, it was the timing. He had done this while I was grieving. He had done this in the window when I was least able to see it coming. He had taken something that my mother had deliberated over, had sat across a kitchen table and explained to me with intention and care, and he had erased it. Not with cruelty exactly, I think. Elliot doesn't operate in cruelty. He operates in convenience. He'd found an angle and he'd taken it, the way he'd always taken angles, and he hadn't thought about me at all. And I think that was the part that broke something open. Not the anger, the absence. He hadn't thought about me at all. My partner, Owen, we'd been together 4 years by this point. He's a project manager, the most methodical and calm person I have ever known, which has been an extraordinary gift to me. Owen had been suspicious of Elliot for a long time in that quiet way, where he would listen to me talk about family stuff, and then just hold my hand and not say what he was thinking. He said it once, about a year into us being together. He said very gently, "Av, I don't think your brother sees you the way you see him." I had told him he didn't understand. I had told him that underneath everything, Elliot loved me. I don't know if that's true anymore. I don't think he doesn't love me. I think love, for him, has always been something that exists alongside whatever's convenient for him, and when those two things conflict, convenience wins. Owen sat with me while I went through everything. He didn't tell me what to do. He poured the tea and he pulled up the land registry website and he sat beside me while I started to understand the shape of what had happened. The land registry was public. I could see the transfer. I could see the date. I could see that it had been filed 11 days after my mother died, which meant my brother had started the process before she was in the ground. I made an appointment with an estate litigation lawyer in Ottawa. Her name was Dr. something. No, she wasn't a doctor, that's not right. She had the kind of last name that sounds like a title. In any case, she was referred to me by my mother's lawyer, and when I sat across from her and put the two documents on the table, the fraudulent old will and the legitimate updated one, I watched her read them both and I watched her expression do something that I can only describe as becoming precise. She said, "This is will fraud. Under the Criminal Code of Canada." She said it clearly and without drama. She said the forged signature, the suppression of a valid testamentary document, and the fraudulent property transfer were each individually actionable, and together constituted a serious criminal matter. She said the land title could be reversed through the courts with the valid will as evidence. She said I should file a complaint with the Ontario Provincial Police. I did both things. I also called my sister. This was the conversation I had been dreading, in a way I didn't fully understand until I was in it, because Bet hadn't known. I was sure of that. Bet is many things, but she is not strategic and she is not dishonest. And she had been on a plane back to Vancouver before any of this had been filed. When I explained it to her, there was a very long silence, and then she said, "Elliot told me the lawyer had made an error, that it had already been corrected, that the house was always supposed to be split 3 ways. She had believed him. She had received paperwork with her name on it and she had believed her brother when he told her it was a correction of a mistake. I don't blame her for that. I want to say that clearly. She was grieving. She was far away. She had been handed an explanation that was plausible if you hadn't been sitting at that kitchen table with our mother 14 months before she died." Bet came back to Ontario to give a statement. She signed an affidavit. She has not spoken to Elliot since. The investigation took 8 months. The OPP fraud unit was, I will be honest, slower than I expected. Not because they didn't take it seriously, but because there was a procedural queue and document verification that I did not fully understand the scope of when I started this. My mother's lawyer's records, the original will, the land registry timestamps, the signature analysis, it all had to be documented and processed and verified. My litigation lawyer had already filed in Superior Court to reverse the property transfer, and that proceeding ran parallel to the criminal investigation. During those 8 months, I lived in a strange suspended state. I went to work. I did my job. I drove past my mother's house sometimes, which still had some of her things in it, and which still, absurdly, had the clay wind chime she'd had on the front porch for 15 years. I thought about her a lot. I thought about her sitting at that kitchen table, trying to make sure I was protected. And I thought about how she couldn't have anticipated this particular thing, this specific dimension of what her son was capable of. Elliot called me twice during those 8 months. The first time, 3 weeks after I'd filed with the OPP, he told me I was making a mistake. That I was destroying the family over a misunderstanding. That he had genuinely believed the old will was the valid one. And that there was no need to involve the police in a family matter. His voice was very reasonable. He was using his reasonable voice the way he always did when he wanted something. I told him I would not be speaking to him without a lawyer present, and I hung up. The second call was 6 months in. He didn't say much. He said he was sorry that things had gotten to this point. I noticed he didn't say he was sorry for what he'd done. He said he was sorry that things had gotten to this point, which is a different sentence. I didn't say anything. I ended the call. The property transfer reversal came through first. Superior Court ruled in my favor based on the valid will and the evidence of the fraudulent document. The house went back into my name alone. I drove there the day the confirmation came through. I sat in the driveway for a while. The clay wind chime was still there, turning slowly in the November wind. The criminal matter resolved 4 months after that. Elliot was charged with 1 count of forgery under Section 366 of the Criminal Code of Canada, and 1 count of fraud over $5,000 under Section 380. He entered a guilty plea, I was told, after the signature analysis came back definitively. The house had been assessed at just over $740,000. He received an 18-month conditional sentence, served in the community, along with 2 years of probation, and a restitution order for my legal costs, which were not insignificant. No jail time. I want to be honest about my reaction to that, because I think people expect me to say I was devastated or that justice wasn't served. The truth is more complicated. I was angry about the conditional sentence for about 2 weeks, and then something settled in me that I didn't expect. He had a criminal record now. The house was in my name. My mother's intention had been upheld in a court of law and preserved in the public record. And he would spend the next 2 years of his life explaining to anyone who asked why he had a fraud conviction. There's something I want to say about my sister, because I think it matters. Bet came back from BC twice during this whole process. She was a witness technically, but she was also just here, more than she'd been in years. We had a long conversation in my kitchen in January, around 2 in the morning, and she told me that she had always known, on some level, that Elliot took more than he gave, but that she hadn't wanted to look at it directly. I told her I understood that. I told her I'd spent years not looking at it directly either. We sat there until almost 3, and I made us each another cup of tea, and neither of us said anything about what comes next because we didn't know yet. I've sold the house. I want to be clear about that, because I think some people assume I live there now. I don't. I couldn't. There was too much in that house that I wasn't ready to sit with every day. I sold it through a real estate agent who was very kind, and I used the proceeds to pay off my own condo, to put a significant amount into an RRSP, and to set up some small bursary in my mother's name at the nursing program at the college in the city where she lived. That last part was Owen's idea. I told him about it when we were driving back from the lawyer's office the day the sale closed, and he didn't say anything for a minute. And then he said, "That sounds exactly like something she would have wanted." I think he was right. There's a question I want to ask you before you go, and I want you to know I'm asking it genuinely. What would you have done about my sister? She didn't know. She wasn't part of it, but she had my mother's house in her name for 8 months, and she accepted the paperwork without questioning it. Some people, when I tell this story, say they would have been furious with her. Some say they completely understand her position. I don't know where you'll land. Tell me in the comments. I read them, all of them, and I think about them more than you might expect. If any part of this story resonated with you, if you have ever been the one who showed up while someone else received the credit, if you've ever stood at a graveside and found out later that something was already in motion that you couldn't see, please subscribe. New stories go up every week here on Lunella Bloom, and I need you to hear this, wherever you are watching from. Your name on something matters. Your presence matters. The work you do, that no one films or applauds or acknowledges, it matters, and sometimes, eventually, it can be proven. Take care of yourselves. Hold close the people who actually show up.